But it comes so quickly, we assume, wow, and then it says, and the parallels go on and on. We're like, wow. They just threw the elephant at us. Next, let's look at this one.
Furthermore, is there any non-biblical historical evidence of any person living with the name Jesus, the son of Mary, who traveled about with 12 followers, healing people and the like? There are numerous historians who lived in and around the Mediterranean, either during or soon after the assumed life of Jesus. How many of these historians document this figure? Not one.
That seemed pretty conclusive. Again, he hurled the elephant. It's the power of the list. Lists are impressive. Go home, load it up, pause it there, write down the names, go to a library, or if you do internet research, consider multiple sources and just look up the names. What did he say? This is a list of first century, what's the H word? Historians. Twice he called them first century, say it again, historians. This is very clear, and that is a lie. There are 2, 3, maybe 4 historians on the list, but these are the actual people on the list. Oh, wait, before we put that up, I remember looking at the list and saying, I don't think, from what I recall, there's that many first century historians' work that actually exists to this day. We don't have that many extant manuscripts from that many first century historians. The list is already bigger than the number of first century historians that I think even exist, that we have their manuscripts of. And so we just slow it down, write down the names, check it out, and honestly, this is what you will find if you do the research. Here we go. Aside from a couple of historians, you'll also find that there is Aulus Persius, who is a playwright. Remember, he's saying, how come these people don't mention Jesus? There's Columella, an agriculturalist who wrote primarily about trees. So unless Jesus was a mighty oak, he's not going to get mentioned. There's Lucanus, who's a poet, whose only surviving work concerns the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. There's Phaedrus, who wrote fables, like Aesop's fables. There's Petronius, who's a novelist, and only one of his novels survives. There's Pomponius Mela. I want to have another kid just so I can name him Pomponius. I think that's awesome. Pomponius Mela. Hey, he's a Roman geographer living in Spain. There's Rufus Curtius and Quintus Curtius are 2 separate names on the list. Do your homework. You'll find out those are 2 different ancient names are referring to the same person, so they got 2 points out of that one person. So that person better be pretty special. Well, that person is a Roman historian whose only surviving work is a biography of Alexander the Great. Sadius Cilicius is a Roman poet. Theon of Smyrna is a mathematician. And hey, Livy is their best and worst on the list. Livy is a bona fide first century Roman historian. It is the worst blunder. His name is on the list. He died in 17 AD, before Christ even began his ministry. This is deception. This is lying. But people buy it up, then quickly flash forward it to the next friend and say, look at this. And people are shocked. Let's pause for a minute and look at some of the positive evidence for the historical Jesus. I want to give you a quick answer to a silly question. Did Jesus exist? Here's the quick answer. Of course, he has to. It's actually impossible for him not to exist, and here's why. One of the things that Jesus mythicists, theorists, do not deal with, there's a conspiracy of silence about it. They do not deal with his teaching. The teaching of Jesus exists. It exists. And it exists by the end of the first century. You can't escape it. It comes to us from multiple independent primary sources by the end of the first century. The theorists will focus on the story arc, but embedded within that story arc is teaching that gives indisputable evidence of coming from a single point, a brilliant mind that is deeply enmeshed within first century Jewish worldview. And this teaching can't actually be pulled out. It can't be turned into pagan teaching borrowed from astrotheological sources. The teaching is so embedded within a first century Jewish religious worldview, it's the only way actually it makes sense. If you try and separate it from that, it begins to break down. And this teaching exists from a single point within the first century. So on this point, all scholars would agree that there is a single person who is most likely called Jesus. You can say we don't know his name, or make up a different name. Say we'll call him Bob, for instance, and we'll call it the what about Bob theory. Maybe he came up with it. Well, this single person in the first century who came up with this teaching, it's more likely his name was Jesus, because it was also a very common name within the first century. And this person, as a traveling teacher, because we have multiple points of origin of his teaching that cohere together and are later gathered together in the Bible, this teaching comes from this single mind who is a radical revolutionary, deeply embedded, enmeshed in a first century Jewish worldview. Can't take it out of that. That person exists. He exists, and he can't not exist because the teaching wasn't there, and now it's there before the end of the first century within a Jewish context. That's clear, and that's undebatable. Now the conversation has shifted from did Jesus exist to did the Jesus that we know so much about through his teaching also perform miracles, die, rise from the dead, etc. Now you're focusing the shift to the resurrection as evidence of his personhood as opposed to did Jesus exist. The question, did Jesus exist, the theory itself is just rationally, logically untenable. Let's look at an example at Matthew chapter 5. You have your Bibles open in Matthew chapter 5. Out come the glasses. We introduced them last week. It was a wonderful fashion show. Now, I got them just to look more intellectual for today. Look at verse 17 in Matthew chapter 5. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Jesus claims that his teaching is going to help reorient and revolutionize the Jewish relationship with their own scriptures, with their own Torah, with their own teaching. And everything he goes on to say then grows out of this firm connection with a Jewish understanding of God, of the world, of creation, and of religious ceremony and law. He claims I'm not abolishing it, but there's a but in there. I am coming to fulfill it. In other words, I will absorb it all to myself, then you will follow me. Rather than the system, you'll follow me relationally. And he comes then and calls them out of a religious mindset into a relational mindset that is revolutionary. But this only makes sense within a historical first century Jewish context. Then he goes on to teach something that theologians call the 6 antitheses. They are 6 statements of comparison, the 6 antitheses, where Jesus follows the teaching pattern of, you have heard it said, but I tell you. You have heard it said, but I tell you. This is how it was, but this is the new revolution I'm calling you into. This is what your worldview wrapped itself around, but here's how I'm turning it on its head. And he does this in extreme ways. And you can see this pattern throughout chapter 5. And we're just walking through one chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, and this enmeshment with Judaism is the foundation for the teaching throughout. But look at verse 21. You have heard it said that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And then he goes on basically to say, but I'm telling you, just hatred, disrespect, name-calling, an attitude of the heart is as bad as murder. Take the action and back up and say, well, what are the emotions and the attitudes that lead to that action, and start working there. And then he says, you have heard it said in verse 27, well, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that you should not look with lust. Take the actions, work backward, and start to work on your internal issues. And he goes on throughout the rest of the chapter. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say do not resist. That's verse 38 and onward. In verse 43, you've heard that it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies. And he teaches the radical concept, the unparalleled concept of enemy love, radical, nonviolent resolution of conflict. And we see this now on every chapter as we work through. This is not duplicated or paralleled to any pagan religion. It is a revolutionizing of a thoroughly Jewish worldview